Our world is facing unprecedented social, economic, and ecological risks resulting from extreme growth over the past 100 years. This extreme growth is called by many experts the Great Acceleration and is wholly unsustainable. Our society is quickly reaching the limits to growth and is beginning to unravel. With depleting resources, our future will have much less energy available, and we are unprepared for the impacts of this. How businesses or organizations respond to this unraveling will affect everyone and everything. Understanding the how and why informs future pathways and where our efforts could likely prevail. We need bold vision, implementation, and actions from all perspectives and all viewpoints. With this in mind, I organized a workshop for our community to explore these topics titled Transitioning to a Resilient and Sustainable Future. It was held on July 25th, 2024 in Rochester, Minnesota. My name is Idso, and I've been an advocate for sustainable living for more than a decade. I co-founded the Rochester Earth Fest celebration in 2014 and the Wright School of Sustainable Living in 2022. In 2019, I won the Mayor's Medal of Honor for Sustainability, and I teach several community education classes, including an introduction to permaculture and building community resilience. I was fortunate to have two other excellent speakers to join me today. Ashley Hodgson is a healthcare economist who teaches as an associate professor at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. She also teaches behavioral economics. Her YouTube channel, The New Enlightenment, explores topics related to economics, governance, and epistemics, that is, the determination of truth and validity in a world of social media and increasing power concentration. Don Hall has served in a variety of capacities throughout the Transition Towns movement over the past 15 years and is currently training coordinator for the International Transition Network. Don holds a master's in environmental leadership from Naropa University, is a certified permaculture designer, and lives in community in Boulder, Colorado. He is the author of the newly released book titled The Regeneration Handbook: Transform Yourself to Transform the World. Okay, the title of my presentation is Detour Ahead. Kind of go on a traffic theme here. So we've been on a target over the last 100 years or so of continuous growth, and we want to reduce our carbon emissions. We want to keep growing also. That's kind of our expectations currently. But if that's not correct, if that's not actually what's going to happen, we need to be aware of that so that we can plan appropriately and not overbuild or, so we can invest our resources wisely. This is from the World Economic Forum. World Economic Forum, they do a global risk assessment every year. It comes out in February. So you can see they look at economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technological risks that are on the horizon. Sent out a questionnaire to CEOs of large corporations, heads of state, and then they get this information. What I want to point out about this is, yes, there's a lot of things like climate change, but you'll see all the lines, how they connect. All of these things are interrelated. So our problems are systemic. They're not just climate change. They're not just natural resource shortages. They're all kind of tied together by these lines. We're looking at a systemic problem here. So what is a meta-crisis? A meta-crisis can be understood as a dangerous transitional period from the current global civilization to something new and uncertain. If humanity survives, it will be because a world system emerges that is capable of navigating the meta-crisis. This will require, among other things, changing the deep-seated social dynamics that are generative of global catastrophic existential risks. Many of you know Nate Hagans, who has spoken here in Rochester several times at Earthfest and at other events. He lives just across in Wisconsin, across the river from Red Wing. And he has a concept called the Great Simplification. That is, at some point here, we're going to see a considerable drop in our GDP, like a 30% drop. Is just kind of what he doesn't know how much, but it's just kind of a ballpark. So he has this podcast, and he interviews a different expert from around the world each week. And that's actually how I met Ashley, because he interviewed Ashley, and so we got together, and I was able to get her to come here today. So fantastic work. In his Great Simplification, he says, we're about to transition from the greatest concentration of energy and resources ever amassed on this planet by a species into something different, because we cannot continue to grow. And I'll be elaborating more on this later. But this is from a couple weeks ago, one of his podcasts. He has, in addition to interviewing experts each week, he has these Franklies, he calls them, every week or two, and it's just kind of whatever he's thinking about at the time. I thought this little segment here was quite relevant to kind of setting the stage for our conversation today.
I would like to talk about the future and some of the things that are likely to happen that are out of our control, and because of them, some of the things that might be in our control. I'd like to think about the control knobs or the volume knobs of the future. And I'm going to list 10, which are definitely not exhaustive categories, of what future decades might be of things out of our control. And here are the 10 volume knobs of the future. First of all, many of you will instantly agree and understand this first one, and many of you will shrug it off. But the volume knob from cooler to a warmer world will be unfolding over coming decades and centuries, unless something incredibly bizarre, like a nuclear war, were to happen. This year, because it's an El Nino year, it probably will peak and then we'll go back down for a few years, but the trend is higher. I don't know where we're going to stop, but a 2 degree is almost a certainty. 2.5 and 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times are quite possible, if not likely. And this has major, major consequences for how we live, maybe not here in northern United States per se, as much as in Saudi Arabia last week on the pilgrimage, over 1,000 people died because the temperature was 51 Celsius, like 125 or something. This is going to have a huge role in our lives. At this point, it's largely out of our control. It's going to cause hundreds of millions of migrations northward of humans. The volume knob on heat will be going up. Next, and we're already starting to see this, is the volume knob on freedom to constraints. And if freedom is the high volume, it's going to be dialed down towards more and more constraints. On the upslope of the carbon pulse with available credit, we lived in open societies, democracy, and lots of rules, lots of freedom, very few rules. And I think that's going to start to reverse with rationing and taxes and regulations and prohibitions, etc. We have just lived through one of the freest times in history, and that volume knob is going to go the other direction. Unipolar to multipolar. That is the way that we went in the last century, and now the volume knob's going to go the other way. We're headed towards a multipolar world. You can see this happening every day. I was just overseas, and you can see the narrative in the United States is different about the United States than it is the rest of the world. People are watching what's happening in Israel, and both Israel and the United States are losing a lot of global goodwill because of what's happening. The United States, Russia, China, all of this is ultimately about resources and power and control. And while on the upslope of the carbon pulse, everyone had access and could print money and could grow their own economies, which gave more resources and goods and services to their population. And now we're hitting limits. So this is a world of more conflict and less peace, and a world of different countries choosing sides, etc. There are certainly things we can do to avert the worst of this, but for most of us, this geopolitical game of risk is beyond our control, and that volume knob is going to be going up. Credit versus cash. We have lived in a world where cheap, available borrowing in order to consume now and pay with income in the future has been prevalent, at least in the industrial North. And this is going to start to change. We're adding $1 trillion in debt every 3 months in the United States. This is all backstopped by the Federal Reserve, the central bank, massively expanding their balance sheet, not only in the US, but around the world. What is money is starting to be a question. There's no doubt that governments around the world will continue to print money, backstop things. But over time, it will become less and less credit-worthy borrowers. Interest rates will go up. It won't be as easy to get a loan, let alone a loan with cheap interest. So over time, we're going to be using our credit cards as citizens alive on the planet less than we are today. And cash and paying upfront is going to become higher up on the volume knob. Richer versus poorer. The volume knob is going to tend towards poorer in the sense of less energy and material throughput per human on the planet. Of course, there will be a distribution aspect on that. But we've just been through an amazing uptick in goods and services. Population times consumption, we're 1,000 times larger economy today than the year 1500. And that's going to start to reverse. So on average, there will be wider and deeper poverty in the world. And then a little sub-knob on the rich versus poor is the equality versus inequality. And I expect, at least for a while, inequality will continue to stretch both in wealth and income, especially with AI added into the mix. Once the great simplification starts in earnest, that definitely will become poorer, but the inner volume knob will change, because a lot of the richest people in the world will lose a lot of their wealth in that Wile E. Coyote Ponzi scheme poof moment at some indeterminate future date. As I mentioned before, peace versus conflict is another volume knob. I meant that in the geopolitical sense, but this will also be in the more local sense. Yesterday, the government of Kenya had riots because they put an eco tax on plastics and diapers and things like that, and people revolted and burned down the parliament building, and they had to repeal the tax today. These sorts of events where citizens react with angst and sometimes violence are going to become more the norm. So the volume knob is going to go up from peace and stability to more conflict. Global versus local. The carbon pulse, cheap energy, available credit, peace in the world have allowed us to continue expand the global economy to just-in-time complex supply chains with letters of credit, and we've created very complicated global distribution of food and micro components, et cetera. And not only because energy is going to get expensive, but also because of move toward a multipolar world. Some of these interconnected lanes of commerce and agreement are going to shrink. And there's going to be more nearshoring and more things made locally. And that means we're going to have less of the things available that we used to. And some of the things that we still do import will be more intermittent and more costly. So I think the world is about to become a bigger place again in coming decades. That doesn't mean that global trade is going to stop, but it might be limited to very selective things. And actually, this could be a good thing, but we are headed from globalization more towards a more local and regional world in coming decades. Another volume knob is a unified, collective goal and conversations to more isolated and tribal conversations. There's so many issues in the world right now, and a lot of people tend to focus on one or two, but we're all part of a growing capitalist, materialist, status based on consumption society. And as that phrase, you're going to find different flavors of how people respond to this that are going to be isolated from other demographics, both globally and in countries. And we're going to become much more in-group focused. So far, the in-group focus of the last few decades is I'm a Green Bay Packer fan and I don't like Chicago Bear fans, but the in-groups of the future are perhaps going to be a little bit more serious than sporting events. The future versus the present. Right now, energy surplus has allowed us to care about the environment and care about the future. And as events get tougher, the volume knob is going to move from the future back to focus on the present. Events will steepen the discount rates of people, which actually, as an aside, makes it even more important, more imperative that the pro-social, pro-future humans out there now engage before those cultural discount rates steepen. So I think there's going to be a volume knob shift towards a focus on the very near term. Lastly, out of a list of 100 of these that I probably could have come up with, is we're going to move from a complex situation to more of a simplification. That doesn't mean that we're not going to use artificial intelligence and continue to innovate and have amazing technology. But over time, the weight of all the trends that I'm describing here are going to lead to a more simplified society because we can't afford all the nodes, all the really resource and trade and energy intensive institutions we have today. I mean, just take medical care, for example. I mean, look at 20% of American GDP goes to the healthcare industry, and it's really a patch. It's not making us healthier. It's just dealing with existing metabolic syndrome and other problems. So in the future, we're going to have to use simpler methods for a lot of the things in our society. We'll have to use 20% of the money and energy to get 80% of the benefits that we used to, things like that. So gradually, and many countries, Ukraine, Syria, Bangladesh, Madagascar, Afghanistan are already approaching a simplification. More countries will be joining that.
Kind of sets the tone for, by the way, I'm the depressing speaker, and Don and Ashley are going to come in and kind of show us the light at the end of the tunnel. So we've got a rough road ahead. I'm going to talk about some more issues that we're dealing with, and then I'm going to get into what's really at the heart of all of these issues. So first off, we're exceeding planetary boundaries. Stockholm Resilience Center identified 9 planetary boundaries which, in order to have a healthy planet, we need to not exceed the safe operating space. Of these 9, we've already greatly transgressed 6 of them, and the 7th one is on the verge. So a little about these. Novel entities, these include synthetic chemicals and substances such as microplastics, endocrine disruptors, and organic pollutants. There's hundreds of thousands of synthetic chemicals now produced and released to the environment, and that's not real well regulated. That's a problem. We all know about climate change. Biosphere integrity is the maximum extinction rate compatible with preserving the genetic basis of the biosphere's ecological complexity. Freshwater change. This boundary considers changes across the entire water cycle over land. Blue water is surface and groundwater, and green water is plant available water in the soil. Land system change. This boundary focuses on the three major forest biomes that globally play the largest role in driving biogeochemical, geophysical processes. And these are the tropical, the temperate, and the boreal. And it looks at the amount of forest cover remaining in each of these. Biogeochemical flows. This boundary considers nitrogen and phosphorus as these two elements constitute fundamental building blocks of life, and their global cycles have been markedly altered through agriculture and industry. In ocean acidification, this boundary considers the carbonate ion concentration in surface seawater. Currently, it's within the safe margin, but it's expected that that will be transgressed soon. So reducing our emissions to zero will not solve most of these because it's based on our consumption rather than fossil fuel use. Social unraveling. We have increased poverty, inequality, racism, and other forms of discrimination, antisocial responses to scarcity, authoritarianism, and impacts of technological change. We have a declining total fertility rate, and I think this is a combination of social changes, but it's also endocrine disruptors, which are affecting sperm count in males. So 2.1, that black line there, is the line. If you drop below that, then your population begins decreasing. Africa right now is the only continent that's still above the 2.1. We're below it right now, but our population is still increasing, and that's because it takes a couple of generations before it starts to make an impact on the population. And a lot of our, Social Security, we're counting on more and more people to support us old people, so we can go out and do things like this. This is another way of looking at this. This is a population pyramid. The chart on the left is when I was born in 1958. So I was at the tail end of the baby boomers. We didn't have very many people at the top, but we've got a lot of us down there on the bottom to support the system. Now it's kind of flipped around. In 2024, we've got a lot more people at the top and not as many people coming up on the bottom. That's going to be problematic. Immigration and migration. We all know about immigration on the US-Mexico border. Migration within our country. As climate change worsens, all the red area there and the yellows, as time goes on in the decades to come, they're going to be wanting to move up into the green space. So we can expect over the coming decades, perhaps millions of people migrating up from the south and expecting to find a place to live, and how are we going to accommodate them? Societal risks are being transformed. There's a study over there. It's written by David Korowitz, who's got a lot of great papers out there on global risk, global systemic risk, systemic failure, and societal responsiveness. This is a headline from the global computer crisis last week. What the global systemic risk is, we've got, as a globalized world, everything is connected. So when one line of code accidentally gets put in on one side of the world, it affects the entire globe, and that can affect our utilities. It can affect Our banking systems are all tied together. So these are the systemic risks. With cybersecurity, if something impacts that's affecting our resilience. And the more we can relocalize and bring those things back and have more control over them, the more resilience we'll have. Financial risks. We have the BRICS Plus, which is, many of you probably, I'm sure, know what this is, but it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa started a group and kind of trading amongst themselves. Now it's up to like 35 countries. They're beginning to develop their own currencies and not trading in dollars anymore. The American dollar has been the reserve currency for the last 40 years or so, and that means that all oil had to be traded in dollars, and that was a big benefit for the United States. And if that goes away, that's going to add a lot of financial difficulties for the United States. Bank insolvency. With the many years of almost zero interest rates, a lot of commercial buildings were built, and now a lot of them are sitting empty. And with interest rates going up, they can't afford them anymore. They're sitting empty. We could have some banking issues with those being foreclosed on. Deglobalization. As I said, we've spent the last 30, 40 years moving all of our manufacturing industries overseas, where we could get it made cheaper with less regulations. But now we're realizing, as tensions are increasing with China and with Russia, with them developing the alternate currencies, we're realizing that that's a risk to our security, not having that locally, on here. So, President Biden has started taking steps to bring more of that back. Building semiconductors and things like that in the United States. But that's going to take time to happen, and a lot of money, and it's going to increase the cost of everything. So, reduce speed ahead. Now I want to get to kind of what's at the crux of all of these things. Gross domestic product, GDP. It's primarily goods and services. That's what it is. And what do you need to make goods and services? You need energy and materials. We think that money drives the economy. It's not. It's the resources and energy are what are the economy. This is a chart on the left of global GDP from 1900 to 2022. And on the right is the global energy use consumption from 1900 to 2022. They're very similar, and that's because they're directly correlated. If you want to increase your GDP and make more goods and services, you need more energy and materials to do that. So if we want to reduce carbon emissions, for instance, we need to reduce GDP, which reduces the amount of stuff we're making, the amount of energy, the amount of mining, and that's kind of the direction we're going here. I'm all in favor of wind and solar, but it can't be just wind and solar. And this is also broken down by source. So the bottom is traditional biomass, then coal, oil, natural gas, hydropower. Way up at the top is renewable energy. So as much effort as we've done, we've got a smidgen. And all of the fossil fuels have continued to increase. So we haven't reduced fossil fuels yet, but we've reduced some of the growth of them. I was born in 1958 again, and the energy consumption, total energy consumption, has doubled twice in my lifetime and will double at least one more time if I live, hopefully, to a fairly old age. This shows it another way. This shows that with GDP, energy consumption goes up with GDP, carbon emissions go up with GDP, and ecological footprint goes up. So it's all tied together. That's just kind of an important how this all ties back to energy and resources. And of course, we expect to continue growing forever. That's, I'm sure, what Rochester has big plans, and our country, no politician has ever been voted in for saying that we're going to reduce our GDP. So it's not a popular topic. Can this continue? I don't think so. In fact, I know it won't. What's going to happen is what we're talking about. Nate mentioned the carbon pulse. The carbon pulse is, in the last couple hundred years, we found coal, and then oil, and then natural gas. When you look at it over the long time scale, we've used about half of the economically viable fossil fuels to this point. So we're pretty close to the top there. When we go tip over and start heading down on the other side of that, GDP is energy. When energy goes down, GDP is going to go down. And we're not going to choose that. It's in the physics of all of this. So another thing about the carbon pulse is, money is a claim on energy and debt is a claim on the future. On the left-hand side is the carbon pulse on a shorter time frame, but with no debt. So typically it should be a nice curve going up and then a nice curve going back down the other side. And that's kind of where we're at, and I would say 2004 when conventional oil peaked. But instead of kind of accepting, realizing, okay, maybe this is problematic, maybe we should start reducing our consumption, moving down, we didn't do that. We added trillions of dollars of debt. And what that does is, we got more through shale oil and oil sands and the other unconventional oils, we were able to get more out, but it kind of pushes the timeline forward, but then you have a sharper drop on the backside. This is another chart. So on the bottom here, the dark gray, that's the conventional oil, land-based, Beverly Hillbillies oil that was really cheap to get. And that's all the Mideast oil. So we had a lot of that. But that's peaked and that's declining. The next one up is the shallow water oil fields out in like the Gulf of Mexico. It's not very deep. It's still pretty affordable to get out. But then we start getting into deeper and deeper, more of the unconventional oils, which is deep sea. You can see in that bright yellow in the middle there, that's the shale oil that we started ramping up in 2010. And there's oil sands in there, is that red one. And the top line up there, I want you to pay attention to that. So that is the energy required to produce energy. So when it's really cheap, when oil is really easy to get out, it doesn't take much energy to get it out. So you have a lot of energy, a lot of oil energy left over to apply to our society. But as we get into more and more unconventional oils that cost more to get out, the top yellow line is how much is left after we get it. It's also called the energy cost of energy. The energy cost of energy has risen from 2% in 1980 to 10% today, which is a five-fold increase in the economic rent demanded of energy users by the resource set available to us. So that is basically a tax on everything that uses oil. So, and that's going to continue to get worse as the conventional oils are depleting rapidly, and we're using the unconventionals make up a greater portion of our total oil. That's going to continue to increase. And you can see by 2050, we're going to be at about 50%. So if you bring up 2 barrels of oil, it's going to take 1 barrel to do that. So there's a point there where it's just not worth it anymore. So we're not going to get all the oil that's available. There's going to be a financial point there where it's just not going to be worth it. But it's going to get really expensive before that. So this is another interesting thing, and I think this has a lot to do with why our homeless population is increasing and it's getting harder and harder for people. What we were just talking about on that energy cost of energy, this is some work by Dr. Tim Morgan. Has some great, I love his articles. He's brilliant. The top line there, our GDP. And then we spend money on our essentials, we spend it on investment, and then we have discretionary spending. Back in the 80s and 90s when we had really cheap essentials and the energy cost of energy was very low, we had a lot of money left over for investment and discretionary spending. So going on trips, buying boats. But as time goes on and we get that extra tax from the energy cost of energy increasing, we have less left over for investment and discretionary spending. That's something that we need to be aware of and plan for that. This is another chart by Dr. Morgan. So we have unsustainable debt. So the blue line down there is basically our material GDP. Since 2000, we've been adding in the United States and globally an incredible amount of debt. We're up, the United States is at 35 trillion now, and globally we're at like 250, 300 trillion. And then the other thing is financial assets line, which is what they call shadow banking. But they don't really know how much that is because they don't have to report those investments and things like that. But I think some of our pensions and things like that are in this line. So there's upwards of $1,000 trillion in total debt on the globe. Now, all of that debt, somebody's going to want to cash that in at some point and buy goods and services, which are going to require energy and materials. So all of this is future energy and materials that hasn't been mined yet or that. So I mean, we've got everything we've used so far, plus we've got all of this that's already been committed to. I don't think everybody who has debt there is going to actually get anything out of it. It's going to disappear. Now, this is the last chart here, and this is my favorite chart, limits to growth. In 1972, MIT issued a report titled Limits to Growth. They made a book about it, and they ran a number of scenarios looking at, depending upon how we used our resources, how the population went, what would the future look like? And the question was that they wanted to answer is there a limit to growth, or can we grow forever? They actually found a sustainable one, which if we would have reduced our consumption, leveled off our GDP, managed our population, we could have had a sustainable life at that time. But we didn't do that. So this is the business as usual, which is pretty much panned out the way it's happening. So looking at this kind of ties it all together to me in one simple chart. We look at resources, the blue line. Coming down, so as we continue to use resources over time, our services, our goods and services, so services are healthcare and education, that's the orange line, and then the kind of a gray line is our goods. So our goods and services have continued to increase, our food per capita has increased, and of course our population, and as time goes on, our pollution has increased. That all makes sense. We are now, if you look at the dates, probably align fairly well. We've used about half of our resources. And the resources we've used have been the best resources, the most concentrated, cheapest to extract. So what's left is much lower quality. It's going to be more expensive to extract. The cost of pollution is going to continue, and pollution in the form of, carbon emissions, mitigating that, hurricane damage, wildfires, all of that will continue to increase and make it harder for our economy to continue on. So at some point, those costs start to have an impact on GDP, which is services, goods and services. And they will start to decline. And that's, all of the things I've talked about point toward a decline in the future. So I want to show you another way of looking at this. So money is just a claim on energy. Society really runs on energy and materials. So on the left side there, we've got our, energy and materials, which we had a lot of. And then the middle, products and services, are GDP, and the waste products in the form of biodiversity loss, carbon emissions, plastic pollution, chemical pollution, and socioeconomic problems. I'm going to put this in motion, and we'll see how it goes, and it just kind of So as we go on here, our resources are depleting, our products and services, our GDP is growing, but so is our waste. Now we're at 2024. Now, as we continue, our resources will continue to deplete. Our GDP actually switches and goes the other way again now because of the cost of resources and waste. And we end up with depleted resources, a much smaller economy, and major pollution. So this is how I view things in the world. It's through energy and materials. So the road is closed ahead to our consumption, our lifestyle. We gotta take a detour. So rather than continuing down the road of reducing carbon emissions, only carbon emissions, and maintaining our current growth, we need to exit here to a post-growth economy. So we live in extraordinary times, and I think it's exciting times because we really have a chance to do the right thing and create a new world for future generations. This system isn't working. We think it is, but it's got an end point, and we need to change everything. We need to change the way we govern our economics and our knowledge, and Ashley will talk about this in part 2. We need to change what it looks like to live truly sustainable, resilient, and regenerative lives. Don will talk about that in part 3.
So I'm going to be talking about the New Enlightenment. It's the name of my YouTube channel. It's the way I'm framing how we might think about paradigm shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. Because whatever's coming next, it's going to have to be really different, and it's probably something that doesn't look that much like what we've already envisioned. One of the reasons I use this analogy is the old Enlightenment. This was in the 17th and 18th centuries. They came up with a lot of new ways of thinking about governance, new concepts that they built into the structure of society at that time. So things like checks and balances, due process, the scientific revolution. This was the era of the scientific method. Free speech, human rights, universal education. It was the age of reason, representative democracy, protection against tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the minority. And some of these things had intentions behind them that are not holding up to their original intentions in the current system. In fact, a lot of these ways of thinking and ways of structuring and organizing society, they were organized to get out from under the thumb of power structures at that time, which was the church, it was sort of kingship organizations. There was a lot of things about how power had accumulated over time back then, and a lot of this was meant to say, how do we get out from that? So that was a couple hundred years ago. Now, I think everyone in this room is aware that we are sort of living through this major change point moment in time. And this is predicted on many different levels. So the question is, what is this change going to look like? And this is why I'm calling it the New Enlightenment, as I think there will need to be really different concepts that are parallel to the concepts from the Old Enlightenment, but that take into account some of the features of the modern economy, which includes digital technologies, AI, how interconnected our world currently is, and that will need to change in some ways. Networks matter a lot, networks of people, networks of professional connections. Information and resources move along networks in ways that are different than they would have in the past, in the 17th and 18th centuries, when most people lived in small villages, and even when there was global travel and whatnot, it was slow. So the speed up of the modern world is going to dictate the need for new types of concepts and structures. And that's the general gist of the New Enlightenment. Now, it's going to involve paradigm shifts in these 3 realms. I'm mostly today going to be talking about paradigm shifts in economic realms and a little bit about knowledge systems and how they relate to economic realms, although I do think governance paradigm shifts matter as well. So where I'm going today, first I just want to talk about paradigm shifts. What are they? What does that even mean? And then I want to talk about Ian McGilchrist. I think he provides one of the foundational myths that I think is capable of beginning to move us into a new era. And then I want to talk a little bit about a new analogy for economic growth. I was going to do a discussion, but we're running a little over time, so I'm going to put this all at the discussion part at the end. But then we'll talk about knowledge systems, about economic myths, and about the paradigm shift. Will it be fast or slow? And spoiler alert, I don't know the answer to that, but I think how we think about that and how we think about fast versus slow could help us to move into the future in a better way. So what is a paradigm shift? And this comes from Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Now, he was looking at academic communities when he was looking at this book, but this is the way he conceptualizes a paradigm shift that I think is helpful. So he looks at fields like the field of physics, the field of biology, the field of chemistry. And he notices each field has its own foundational knowledge, own pieces of information that everybody who's going into that field learns the foundational knowledge in the textbooks, in their first class in physics or whatnot, and they build on that knowledge when they become researchers and enter into the community. And the paradigm itself consists of the foundational knowledge plus the methodologies and the research questions in that field that are considered legitimate. Yeah, that research question is a physics question. It does build on this foundational knowledge. And of course, knowledge communities of a particular academic field, it's a community. So it behaves like any community where there are gatekeepers who make sure, yeah, we are keeping everything grounded in our foundational knowledge. That is a paradigm. So what is a paradigm shift? A paradigm shift happens, and there's a little bit of a story to this, where a heretic comes along and says, wait a second, I understand the field, I've gone deep in the field, and I notice that this particular piece of foundational knowledge doesn't quite work. There's something wrong with this. And so the heretic starts to question that piece of foundational knowledge. What's the problem at this point? The problem is going to be that that's really offensive to leaders in the field. Leaders in the field have built up their own academic research on top of this foundational knowledge, and to question this is like to question how smart they are, how valid their research is. That's really, really offensive. So what happens to the heretic? The heretic is attacked by their community. They are pseudoscientists, they don't know what they're talking about, they're stupid, they're not a valid researcher in the field. But knowledge is complex, and so sometimes actually this piece of foundational knowledge actually does have some problems despite the sociology around questioning it. So what happens with a paradigm shift is you start to have people in the field watching and noticing this heretic and being like, wait a second, they have a point. Now, they keep quiet because they don't want to be attacked by the leaders of their field. That's horrible. Like, not everyone is willing to step out in the limelight, but they watch it. They're like, you know what? I'll just read the articles that come out from the heretic. And you may have heard scientific knowledge progresses one funeral at a time. Yeah, it's because the people who are most effective at shutting down the heretic through these social means, eventually they retire, eventually they die and move on. And at that point, it opens the door for some of these people who have been quietly watching to be like, actually, yeah, I see the point here, I see the problem. And when that happens, this new group of people, if they've been thinking about it for long enough, they may have had to come up with how do we reach some of these other great conclusions without this piece of foundational knowledge? And you might actually have to come up with new foundational knowledge that helps you reach these conclusions, which might not be totally invalid, without going through this piece of information here. So what happens is this community, the heretic and the people following them, they build out a new set of foundational knowledge. It still includes the old foundational knowledge, but gets rid of this one thing that was a problem. And they connect it to that, and these people become the new leaders of the field. And then, 30 years down the road, these people will be gatekeeping, and somebody's going to come along and be like, wait a second, this piece is wrong, this piece is bad. And that's a new heretic, and that's how scientific fields move. Now, this is academic fields. There's actually going to be a difference, and I think it's a pretty profound difference when it comes to the nature of the paradigm shift that we are living through. And that is, this is based on a specific piece of knowledge. It is networked in with the rest, but our system has a lot of different parts that are interconnected. So the thing that's not working is more than one little piece of it. It's actually a much bigger piece. But I think the shift we're going to go through is going to parallel this in terms of the way it plays out. Okay, now Ian McGilchrist, I think he has presented something that I think could actually be a foundational myth that could get us through this paradigm shift. And he is a researcher who talks about the right brain and right hemisphere and left hemisphere of the brain. He uses hemisphere. I think that's intentional. He is getting away from some of the stereotypes and some of the pseudoscience around right and left hemisphere as it appears in popular magazines. Oftentimes it's wrong. But that doesn't mean there's nothing real about the differences between the right and left hemisphere. And that's what his research is based upon. He's a neuroscientist, he's a psychiatrist, he's a philosopher. And the basic idea here is that if you look at the human brain and also animal brains, there's a lot more connections within each hemisphere than across the hemispheres. As a matter of fact, there's parts of the brain that inhibit communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. So the question is why? What's going on with that? And the answer is essentially that there are two different types of attention a person can pay to the world, and that those two types of attention need to be kept separate. So this happens in animal brains as well, and I think his bird analogy is really helpful, where one type of attention is the type of attention the bird needs to get the worm. This is narrow and focused, and it's meant for apprehending something, for reaching out and getting. It's meant for exerting power in the world. And then there's a second type of attention needed, which is the attention needed to not be eaten. And that's the attention you pay broadly to the forest around you, which needs to be open to any kind of predator, with any kind of rustling or any kind of indication that, wait a second, I need to get out of here. That has to be a broad attention, and those are the two types of attention. This one is going to be the right hemisphere, the power one is the left hemisphere, and here's a list of the differences between the hemispheres. He gets this by looking at people who have damage to one side of their brain or a stroke on one side of their brain, so people who rely more heavily on one hemisphere than the other. And he looks at all kinds of studies about how these people behave, how they perceive the world differently. So the left hemisphere is in charge of power. Now, of course, power in humans relates to our ability to use language. So when people lose their left hemisphere function, sometimes they can't speak. It's where language is seated. It's where the symbolic world is seated. The right hemisphere understands dynamics. It understands the full context. It understands reality as it actually is. So one way of thinking about this is the left hemisphere is in charge of maps. And of course, maps are about using the world. The right hemisphere is in charge of the terrain, reality. And one particularly helpful thing is, how do these two hemispheres perceive value differently? The left hemisphere perceives value as that which is useful to you, things that are an instrument for you to achieve your goals. Whereas the right hemisphere perceives value as things that are inherently valuable in the world. This is beauty and art and meaning and purpose. And we kind of know the difference when somebody treats us as if we're an instrument for them to get something versus treats us as if we have inherent value. That's the difference between the hemispheres. Oh yeah. So what is the matter with things? He maps this onto what's going on in the world and how we might understand the problems with it. What does it feel like to be in modern society? And there are a couple of analogies that I think the book brings to light. It feels like we're trapped inside a machine. And that is, the machine cannot perceive real value. This is, administration, like hospital administration. Does it understand the real meaning of pain, the real meaning of what the patient truly values? Or is it sort of wrapped up in all of these metrics that sort of have their own operation, but everything is treating the patient and treating the doctor and treating the nurse as an instrument to something that's stuck inside the system. And that on every level, from the hospital to the country to the world, it feels kind of like we're trapped inside a machine that cannot perceive real value, but is moving to achieve its own ends. And then another analogy that resonates with some people is we're trapped in a mad mind. And in the book, he makes analogies between patients who rely on their left hemisphere because of damage to the right hemisphere and schizophrenic patients, which is oftentimes schizophrenic patients have a hyper-logical way of viewing the world. A leads to B leads to C, and everything is mapped onto this clear-cut way of being. And yet, they are often profoundly out of touch with reality. And he says there's parallels there. So both of these analogies map onto left hemisphere modes of operating in the world. And he has two thesis statements that I think are really, really helpful for us. One is that the right hemisphere must be the master, and the left hemisphere the emissary. There can't be an equal relationship between these. And why is this? It's because the right hemisphere is the only hemisphere capable of actually perceiving reality. The left hemisphere can take the reality the right hemisphere gives, and it can do useful things with it. It can build maps, but then those maps need to go back to the right hemisphere to make sure you're checking, are there deviations between this map and reality? So with a culture stuck with the left hemisphere in charge, there needs to be a shift to put the right hemisphere in charge, where the right hemisphere is in touch with reality, with what really matters. That's his first thesis. The second thesis is that the type of attention we pay to the world shapes what the world actually becomes. And you can imagine there are nodes in the economy where people make decisions. There's a lot of cost-benefit analyses where it's what matters, how do we make these trade-offs? And of course, the right hemisphere, left hemisphere frame may help you think about, okay, sometimes the cost-benefit analyses have this instrumentalized way of perceiving what is actually valuable that doesn't do that. But the discussions in those boardroom meetings about where resources flow, those actually determine what gets invested in the world. And if we think of it, the economy as a garden, there are people who sit at nodes of power where they determine which parts of that garden get watered and which parts dry up and wither away. And that comes out of the type of attention people pay to the world in terms of value. So this is a really deep thesis. I can't even fully go into it, but he says attention is a creative act. It's one of the most creative things we can do is decide where do we place our attention. And attention is a moral act. We can either humanize or dehumanize depending on the type of attention that we pay to somebody or to something. And I think this is really profound in terms of reshaping how we think. Okay, so I want to go into, in this case, economics. I want to give one way, this is a small way that I think would be helpful if it were to reshape the conversation around economics. Now, this talk is not about problems with GDP. I could give like a 5-hour-long talk on problems with GDP. Instead, my guess is most people in this room are somewhat aware of the problems with GDP. But I think there's a representative problem that if I'm talking to somebody who has never thought about this stuff, I think this helps them grasp it immediately, which is that if we were to suddenly cure diabetes, it's totally gone from the economy, from the world. GDP would decrease dramatically. Think of the entire industries that are built up around managing that, around the hospital visits. GDP would probably go down by orders of magnitude, by 10% at least, if we suddenly absolutely cured GDP. So this captures this notion that the way we measure economics right now does not capture what really matters, not even a little bit. And if we think about some of the economy is creating things that are truly of value, like class, I think some of my classes are of value. That's part of the economy. But also the treatment of diabetes, that's sort of treating a problem that has been created by the economy, and it might be related to, is the rates of diabetes, does it relate to pesticides in any way? Does it relate to some of these other things that are a side effect of the economy? And I do think a growing share of our economy over time is made up of things that are more in the category of the existence of diabetes driving what we're counting as economic growth. So that's just like a little on the problem with GDP. But what I want to say in terms of reframing the conversation is you oftentimes hear these conversations that get really intense, and they're really important conversations around economic growth versus environmental sustainability, sort of pitting these things against one another. And I think the frame of the conversation is causing a lot of confusion and problems. Growth, of course, exponential growth is definitely an indication that there could be coming a collapse of some sort at some point in time. Now that freaks people out, collapse, like what will collapse look like? There's a lot of ways collapse could look. I'm not even gonna talk about this, but I do think one of the analogies that is important to understand, but also we need multiple analogies here, is the gerbil on the island analogy, where you have a population of gerbils on an island, they reproduce, so the population is growing exponentially. At some point, they're going to eat up all the food, and there will be a population collapse of the gerbils. And this captures a dynamic that's a system dynamic that is built into many, many systems. And we kind of know, I think everyone in this room at least, understands this is kind of where we're headed when it comes to the economy and growth in economic activity as we know it. But I think we need a different analogy to complement these. We're not throwing this one out, but we need different lenses to look at the same problem. And this next analogy, I want to give some disclaimers ahead of time to say, I don't mean this to be like, let's reframe how we think of it so that we can all be happy about whatever collapse might be coming. That's not my intention here. But sometimes I hear a lot of people, including actually today, say, we cannot grow forever. Growth forever is not possible. I actually think that's wrong. And I think we can see it's wrong by looking out the window. Do forests grow forever? There's always growth in a forest. There's also death. There's also, regeneration. There's stuff going back in the soil. But I think a new growth we need to add to the toolbox is the notion of a forest that is bound on four sides by a rock quarry. So the forest cannot get bigger physically along certain dimensions. But within those bounds, there is something that is constantly growing and regenerating. And here's why I think we need this analogy. I think a lot of people, when they hear this conversation, the image they have in their head is okay, everybody in the economy just stop trying to create. Stop trying to create meaning and value and purpose, and just be happy with sitting in your backyard. And they sort of view it as this like extremely disempowering thing where they're not allowed to create. And yet humans desire creation, and not all creation has to use resources, right? You can create a party, you can create you created this. This didn't require that many resources to bring people together, maybe a little bit, but there can be bounds at the same time that you're allowing a constant creation, which might be felt as growth. And sometimes I'll hear in this conversation some people saying, well, we need something that feels like growth that's not really growth. And I think the problem there is that when we're talking about growth, if we always have GDP as we know it implied after growth, then we're not escaping the paradigm we need to escape. And so my biggest problem with the conversation around economic growth versus sustainability is that by just saying economic growth without specifying what comes after that word, we're sticking ourselves with GDP as we know it. So we need to be thinking about what is the thing that would continue to grow through human creation that has bounds that do not overpower the environment. So what are the bounds? I mean, the bounds: oil usage, emissions, chemical degradation, human rights, other planetary limits. There's bounds that we need to figure out how do we manage those bounds. I'm not even going to try to come up with today what is a system, or what is a set of institutions that could actually bind these things. We do need those. We need those. What binds those? But within whatever bounds come, we need to be thinking about what are the things that continue to grow, without using the term economic growth, because that's too embedded in the 20th century. Okay, I'm going to skip that for now. All right, so among these three things, I also want to look at knowledge systems just a bit. Knowledge systems are, I think these three things are intertwined, and knowledge systems are in some ways very foundational when people make economic decisions, and which I consider economic decisions about where scarce resources flow. That depends on knowledge they have about what would be of use, how it would be used, what it would look like in the future. So knowledge systems matter. So I did want to ask you all, how do you envision our current knowledge systems? What do these look like for you? And get a few answers to this. And then what problems do you see with our current knowledge systems? Yeah.
I was an engineer. Scads of books and texts and people who have knowledge about all sorts of engineering disciplines.
Okay, so books, like academic books. Books.
Formalized, right? And colleges, universities devoted to it.
Libraries, yes, definitely. Western medicine, absolutely. It's a canon. Yep.
Democracy?
Sure, yeah. Democracy certainly uses information of all kinds all the time. It gathers information about people's preferences through the vote. Yeah, I like it. What else?
Any religion? Capitalism? Like any collective belief system?
Okay, collective belief system, absolutely. And then two, I'd probably add social media and journalism are two more knowledge systems that sort of feed into. What sort of problems do you see with our existing knowledge systems?
Who finances everything? Especially if I think about academia. Who's financing academia now?
Who finances academia and really all of these systems? The financing ends up bending what kinds of knowledge grow and what kinds of knowledge there's just not funding for that. Yeah? Algorithms, yes. Algorithms are doing the same thing and might even be under the thumb of power systems as well. Yeah?
Slowness to change?
Oh, slowness to change. And slowness to change, that's an interesting one because it can be advantageous and disadvantageous at the same time. But yeah, an inability to update our beliefs with response to new facts about the world. Yeah?
Is the energy intensiveness of artificial intelligence?
Yes, this does rely on scarce resources like oil even, and energy to produce some types of knowledge that we're starting to rely on, especially artificial intelligence. Yeah?
How about the culture of individual freedom? So we don't embrace collectivism as well.
Okay, yeah. And I might place that under governance, but I think you're right. I think it sort of goes under both categories. Yeah.
I would say like a tribal or multicultural information base that is passed down from generation to generation in like oral or verbal communication in a family.
Absolutely, that's part of the knowledge systems. What do our parents teach us is true about the world, which is sometimes almost even just implicit, the assumptions they make about the world that get embedded into our knowledge of how the world works. Yeah, very important. Okay, going back to Ian McGilchrist, he's the right brain, left brain guy. He gives us 4 different ways of perceiving reality. And reality, none of these ways are going to be sufficient by themselves. So the first is science, and he is not anti-science. I mean, he's a scientist himself. As a matter of fact, when you hear the right brain, left brain framework. Some people will be like, science is left brain. It builds maps of the world and tries to exert power. But he says, no, wait a second. Science actually does involve both hemispheres of the brain when done properly. So science is a really important tool for understanding reality. There's reason. Now, these two, you might notice, were at the front and center of the old Enlightenment. Science and reason. And those tools were useful at the time. The scientific method is still useful, and he's not saying throw it out. Oh, and by the way, reason, once again, he says, all four of these involve both right and left hemispheres of the brain. With reason, he has really interesting perspectives on a lot of the paradoxes in philosophy are sort of resolved if you think about this right brain, left hemisphere way of viewing things. For example, you've heard the paradox. If someone's ahead of you and they're walking ahead of you, let's say it's a turtle, can you ever catch up to and pass the turtle? And there's this thought experiment that's like, well, when you're halfway to the turtle will move farther, but then you're halfway there again. And with this kind of logic, you can never pass the turtle who's walking that slow. And yet the right hemisphere is like, yeah, you can pass the turtle. Like, I've done it many, many times. And a lot of these thought experiments that are designed through reason, they're maps, but there's some, by kind of breaking reality down into parts, you lose something that's true about the whole. So both of those are important. He's not saying throw them out. But there's two more ways of apprehending or understanding the world that we don't rely enough on, and as a matter of fact, we're skeptical of. One is intuition. And this is when you understand, you've worked in a workplace for long enough, you develop intuitions for why people are doing things and for how things really, really work that can't be easily put into words, can't be easily mapped out. And actually, this is one of the conversations I'd like to bring up at the end from you all is you all have been in different workplaces. You've seen the economy through different vantage points. What are intuitions about how the economy works that do not fit into our maps of how the economy works? Because our maps about how it works are actually broken. They're not perceiving the reality of it. And this includes really, there's the sociology of different groups deeply influences how resources flow. So intuition is part of this. And as a matter of fact, I teach behavioral economics. It's become very popular in economics, and I still love it. I think it's really important. But one of the things it's doing, I have noticed, is useful to people who want to go with the narrative of just put the robots in charge. And that is to cast doubt on people's intuitions. Like to say, don't trust your intuitions, you're too biased. Let the machine do it for you. Which happens to be a mythology that is really convenient for the people who might own artificial intelligence. So I think it's something to push back when you hear people put down intuition. Yes, bias is really important. We need to think deeply about bias. But we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater there. And then the other is imagination. And he separates out left hemisphere from right hemisphere versions of imagination. Or, well, not imagination. He uses a different word. He says the left hemisphere version of this is fantasy, where it's you envisioning your desires being met. And it tends to take weird parts of the world and clump them together without being deeply in touch with reality. Whereas the right hemisphere version, which is what he calls imagination, is where you spend a lot of time looking at reality from many different perspectives, and you're trying to envision what is actually reality, what could be true. And this, in some ways, I think is what we need more of if we're going to envision a system that works better, is we're going to need people who are looking with all of their being at what's going on and imagining what could work given what I know about how human systems work. I love this quote. Okay, so, and he's talking about Herman Weil, who's a philosopher of science. And he says in the book, insight does not, as Weil puts it, drop out of the sky. There is a period of preparation during which an exertion is made, a period which is often long and exhausting. And this is where you learn all of the maps within your field. You learn many, many different maps. You think carefully about What is that physics experiment really saying to us? He says, in this state of fatigue, after this exertion, when the mind relaxes, that the illumination comes. That is the moment the illumination comes. In fact, he comments that it is as though it were necessary for the conscious self to be weakened in order that the unconscious ideas may break through. And this is how scientific breakthrough generally happens. This is also, I think, how economic breakthrough will happen. Is through this process of exertion and imagination, the balance of those two. All right, problems. We've kind of already covered problems with the knowledge systems. Our current knowledge systems, there's many, many problems with them. I could go on and on about this, but two relevant problems are they tend to overemphasize what is measurable and decontextualized from its environment. Very left hemisphere ways of viewing the world, viewing reality. And we've also brought up what is salient and meaningful to people with power. The knowledge that is in those realms gets upregulated in our current system. Okay, so I want to connect this. I want to connect two realms, economics and knowledge systems. And to do this, I want to do an economic retelling of the Emperor's New Clothes. Now, first of all, I think before I do this, I want to define what is an economic system. How am I thinking about what is an economic system? And this is the way I define an economic system. It's a set of institutions. And of course, institutions are what will need to change. A set of institutions that determine where scarce resources flow. Keeping it as simple as possible. And what are scarce resources? I mean, the Earth's scarce resources, those are scarce resources. Oil, trees, other natural resources. It also includes labor. It includes attention, which is increasingly a type of scarce resources that is being coveted in the economy. Now, I will say McGilchrist objects to the term, I don't know if objects is quite the right term, but thinking of these things as resources places them in the realm of the left hemisphere. It's placing them as these are things for us to use and discard, and we are the ones in charge. And his reframing, there's so much in this book, his reframing is the left hemisphere has an engineer attitude towards these things, where an engineer is the engineer of the machine. Engineer, everything is under my control. And that way of thinking about managing the world, managing people, managing the Earth's resources is really, really destructive. It's the left hemisphere mode. The better analogy is the gardener. And what's the difference here? The gardener has to pay really close attention to the needs of the plants and what the plants thrive under according to the plant's own values and their own being. And so it has to be very well attuned to the needs of the things it is managing. And it can't just bring everything under its thumb. It has to be co-creating the garden with the plants there. And I think that's a much better analogy. Now, what are institutions? Institutions are rules, roles, norms, and enforcement mechanisms that structure human relationships. So we think of official institutions like a university or like the government or even a family. Those are institutions for sure. But there's both internal and external institutions. Now, I don't love this language in institutional economics. I think it's kind of confusing. So the language I prefer is internal institutions are institutions of the heart. They're not written down. They're not enforced through code. They're sort of enforced through norms and expectations, and they're enforced through the moral frame oftentimes. That the moral frame is an institution that does end up profoundly directing scarce resources and directing the structure of human relationships. All right, so that's just what is an economic system. With that in mind, back to the economic retelling of the Emperor's New Clothes. So we all know this story. I want to start the story out. We're kind of imagining a medieval town, and we've got an emperor who's really, really into fashion and clothing. And we have small town farmers, And what they create is the most life-giving, life-sustaining thing possible. They create food. They create what really matters. And yet, they don't understand, why do we create the most important thing possible, and yet the fashionistas and the clothes designers and the fabric people who put all the jewels on the fabric, those people make so much more money in this economy than the farmer. And so it's like, what is the deal with this? And in this economy, it's because this emperor is super into clothing. And the emperor has an outsized ability to channel resources and to channel attention even. Even if you say, okay, let's take the treasury away from the emperor still gets to determine who matters and who gets accolades and who gets noticed. So resources flow in the direction of the things valued by the emperor. Now, the key moment in the story is when the snake oil salesman comes and presents invisible clothing to the emperor. So I'm going to tell two different versions of this. One is the classic version that the snake oil salesman, for whatever reason, doesn't have any real clothing. So shows up and says, this is clothing that only really smart people can see. And if you're really smart, you'll be able to see it, and if you won't, if you're not smart, you won't be able to see it. And of course, the emperor is naked, or maybe he's wearing just his underwear to make this PG, and he puts on the invisible clothing. And everybody around the emperor is like, oh yeah, that looks great. And I think that part of the story is really important and informative when we're thinking about the economy. Why does everybody around the emperor say, go along with this? Why do they say, I don't know? And there's actually multiple possibilities here. One is that they could be under the same manipulation that the emperor's under. They could be like, oh, I want people to think I'm smart, so yeah, I see it if everyone else sees it. And then another possibility is just, if they want their position in the court, if they value being able to be the jester and having their little creative outlet, which maybe they really love making jokes, and the only time you can get an audience to make a joke is in the king's court. They know you go with it. You just go along. Yeah, that looks great on you. Now, I want to tell a slightly different version of this. Obviously, the invisible clothing is hard to buy as something that could ever happen. So let me make it slightly more believable by saying, okay, let's say all he has is a few ropes. So that the clothing itself is just a few ropes. It's like drape a few ropes over him and he's still basically naked. And I think one thing about this and the information environment is, at that point, you can start to make arguments that is real clothing. Like for someone who's like, that's not real clothing, that's just some ropes. You could say, no, this is actually brilliant clothing. We know that clothing is all about our projection onto the person. This is artistic. It's making your mind fill in the gaps. You can have really smart people come up with really convoluted arguments that sound valid about why that's legitimate clothing. And with our information environments, to some degree, you have enough people who, if they want their information, their take on the world to be lifted up and projected, doing it in a way that does serve power and serves what power believes to be true is easily done in the social media realm. Okay, and of course, this story here ends with everybody in the town pretends they see the clothing until one kid points out the truth and then everybody laughs, is how it ends. And that implies that everybody knows something. And maybe not the people in the court, but most of the town knows something. I think most people know something is wrong. And this includes the people that you might not think. They may have a different take on it. They may not see the same thing that's wrong that you do, but I think people are intuiting that something is really wrong. What do you think of when you think of an economic myth?
Is an example of a myth, or I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah?
The more you spend, the more you save. Like that kind of myth?
Okay, yeah, I buy that. The more you spend, the more you save. I like that because it's sort of this aphorism that kind of floats in the environment, and it helps structure people's, in fact, I really like that. It helps structure people's understanding of the system they live underneath.
About economic equality can be achieved.
Sure, economic equality can't be achieved. That great example, great myth. So we've got these different economic myths floating around in our head. Yes?
Consumers are rational actors.
Okay, consumers are rational actors. Now that is what I want to talk about, not here, it's a very long conversation. But yes, okay, that's another another economic myth. All right, so yeah, economic myths shape our understanding of how the system functions. And they shape what is considered legitimate within a system. So legitimacy, we're already thinking about economic institutions are founded on economic myths. Now, as you might imagine, some of the economic myths, in fact, a lot of the economic myths that structure our system are profoundly misleading. So 3 examples I want to go through. The Wall Street banker and the Main Street banker. So the Main Street banker is the myth, which is when you start to learn about finance or about economics, it's the image you have in your head of how things work. And it is an image that has actual legitimacy. Now what's going to happen is the people in Wall Street are going to map what they're doing onto this myth in a way that is completely disconnected, but buys them legitimacy. So the myth of the Main Street banker is you've got a small town, and the Main Street banker is really in touch with the needs of the town, the values of the town, how people feel. Like she's in touch with real things in the real economy. She's right-brained in how she thinks. And people in the small town come to her with their small business ideas, and her job is to decide which ones get financed. And of course, you might imagine there's many nodes in the economy where this kind of decision is happening. And so she not only has to understand the reality of that town and their needs, she has to understand and be discerning about which of these potential small business owners is really just engaging in a vanity project. Which of these small business owners has their act together enough and an organized enough Excel spreadsheet of their finances to make a business actually work? Which of these small business owners has an idea that actually maps well onto the needs of the town? And this is the myth of the Main Street banker. Now, of course, you move farther in finance classes, and how Wall Street is built builds upon this myth. It builds upon the legitimacy of the Main Street banker myth. And yet, what happens on Wall Street is not remotely, it's so far disconnected from the reality of the economy that it's trying to, that people think it is creating, that it is false and misleading. So that's one example of an economic myth. Capital itself, the initial image of capital when you learn about it is a machine. It's maybe a plow. It's something that is physical and is really, the images are from the industrial economy, which is no longer the economy we live in. We live in a digital economy, very different type of economy. And so the myths are not going to translate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one, but the myths are not going to translate well into reality. They're sort of how we envision both the legitimacy and even how the system works. Economic growth we've already talked about. The image that people have in their head with economic growth is people getting jobs, right? When you say economic growth, people are thinking, okay, thriving, people getting jobs, people getting well-being, and yet that's not actually attached to GDP as we know it, and increasingly it's not. It's more the fixing and putting Band-Aids over the gaps that already exist. Okay, with that in mind, okay, almost finished. Will this paradigm shift be fast or slow? It's not a question we can actually know the answer to, but I do think it's wise to prepare for a fast change. And Nate Higgins, in the clip you showed, he mentioned the Wile E. Coyote version where people suddenly realize, like right now I think most people are not aware of how disconnected the economic myths are with the way the economy really functions. If there were a moment where most people suddenly became aware of that, that would be a Wile E. Coyote moment in the economy. Something like that could happen. And yet there are things that cannot change quickly. You cannot build trusting relationships quickly. The trusting relationships that exist, you mentioned the networks when there's a crisis. The networks that come together are oftentimes built on whatever trust was there before. I trusted this person from across town. I'm going to be working with somebody across town for this period of time. So there are things that form slowly, and there are things that can happen quickly. And the collapse of some of our societal myths, I think, could happen really quickly. One thing, if we're thinking about how do we practically prepare, I know this talk has been very conceptual, but how do we prepare for something? We can, if we are well prepared, we can prepare in a way that will make it more likely to shift towards something desired. And to think about why this is, we come back to the paradigm shift. This is a story. In some ways, this is a myth, the paradigm shift. We notice that these quiet followers who are afraid to say anything because they don't want the thought leaders in their field to deride them for saying it, them just watching this, the more people who are in this group watching, wait a second, this is invalid, while they're watching it, their brains, their minds are going to have aha moments where they come up with, wait a second, how do I handle my own field given that we have a problem here, given that this piece doesn't work? Their minds, in the quiet moments in the shower, will figure out what other foundational knowledge could get us to connect this other stuff without this piece that's failing. And so the more people who are watching the heretic, and the more people who are willing to be the heretic, to speak up, to keep that conversation alive, the more ready and the faster a paradigm shift would happen when the relevant thought leaders retire. Because all of this new foundational knowledge will be seeding around in people's brains, ready to come on the scenes when that is socially acceptable. Okay, so yeah, what kind of readiness do we need to handle the transition gracefully? This is my last slide with these 3 points. Just 3 things I think we can do practically to prepare for a transition that we cannot know exactly how it will manifest. One is cultivate skills that take a long time to mature, because those skills cannot be made to happen. They cannot happen in that moment of crisis. They need to already be there. And I think building relationships is one of the key things. Building your communities that if there were a crisis, you know who you would go to for this or that other thing. Understanding what's the quirk of each personality. Like, when do they freak out? What are their prickly points? What are their strengths? That's something you can only know by repeated interaction with people. Gardening, learning to grow your own food, is something you also cannot learn overnight. It takes a lot of attention paid to those plants and those flowers and how they thrive and when they die. I think speaking across difference, I haven't spoken about the governance paradigm shift at all pretty much in this talk, but a lot of times, we've mentioned several times in this talk the green tax that people are reacting really negatively to. And I think a lot of times the problem is not the problem. The reaction is not really about the green tax. It's about ceding power to people that they perceive have contempt for them. And there's part of that perception of contempt that is not valid, but there's parts of it that there are people in that group that do have contempt for them. And yet there are people who care about the green tax, who care about the environment, who don't have contempt for them. And so building the skills of even knowing when will a group of people perceive contempt from me or my group, I think will lay out the foundations where trust can be built in a moment if something were to change quickly. The next thing to prepare for transition is to direct our attention to that which has inherent value and needs cultivation. It's this notion of attention as a creative act and attention as a moral act. And we know that the social media world wants to suck our attention into these things that are really divisive and destructive and inherently contemptuous. And resisting that is a choice. And then the last thing for preparing for transition, given how out of touch our perception of our economic system is, We need people who are using their intuition and imagination to be like, what is the truth about how our economy actually works? And this is going to come from many vantage points, people who sit in governments and have seen how these boards of directors make these decisions. It's actually messy. It's from people in many different places in the economy. That intuitive knowledge, I think, will be essential both for creating the new imagination of what could come next, but also for understanding how to get out from this system. So yeah, what I wanted to hear from you, I don't even need those questions. I did want to hear from you. Like, what have you seen in the economy that you feel like, wait, I have an intuition about what's going on here that is not built into the way the economy is currently operating? Yeah. Okay, I love what you just said, goodwill, because I think this also gets at the left brain, right brain thing. The left brain is super cynical, so anytime somebody enacts goodwill or anytime they see goodwill, the left brain immediately turns it into, oh, they're just doing that for their own advantage. So people don't believe that goodwill exists. But the right brain can perceive, no, goodwill actually does exist. It's something that can expand. I love that.
Yeah, so I get to do the really fun part here. This is not my usual book talk. As I said before, I've been traveling around the country for the past month and a half, talking about the Regeneration Handbook. And usually I give a kind of 10,000-foot overview of the book and its major themes. But here I'm going to specifically focus in on practical projects. You know, what might it look like to regenerate this community, regenerate the world? But it is important to recognize that even though practical projects are kind of the most visible aspect of regeneration, that it's really built on a lot of other important ingredients. Otherwise, this wouldn't be stable to just do practical projects without an understanding of context, understanding what are the issues that we're addressing both locally and globally, like Ivan talked about this morning. We also need some kind of vision. You know, where are we going? You know, something that is both inspiring, magnetizing, but also is credible. It's at least within the realm of possibility. And a vision that kind of fits everything together. How do all these pieces work together? We also need to pay attention to what we call in the Transition Towns movement, the inner transition, or what MIT professor Otto Schermer calls the blind spot of leadership, which is the source of change, which is our state of being, our beliefs, our ways of thinking, that we need to interrogate that. So that we're not just running around trying to change everything and actually making things worse in the process. We could do that, and people do. Oh, okay, I missed a slide. But two other essential ingredients of the transition model and also of practical projects underlying them is healthy groups. So if we're in groups that are constantly mired in indecision and conflict and a little political backbiting, and we're not going to be able to get much done in the world. So how do we learn how to collaborate effectively? And also, how do we engage the wider community in this? Because all the solutions are not going to come top down. A lot of them are going to come bottom up. And even if they are top down initiatives from, you know, city, county government, state, federal, international, they still need the community support to be embraced and implemented, right? So how do we do that? How do we not just talk to the people that already think like us, but how do we reach people from all walks of life, engage people from all walks of life? So these are all parts of the book that I'm not going to be talking about today, but they are really essential to have successful, impactful, and long-lasting regenerative projects. They are kind of the foundation on which change is really built. And also a seventh ingredient here is being part of a larger movement. So, no matter how successful we are locally, we're not going to solve all the world's problems here in Rochester. So how can we be part of a wider movement that can do that we focus here, we start with where we are, we start with our community, but we can also link up to people doing similar things all over the world so that we can actually change things on the global scale. So that's just a little preamble here. The first thing I talk about in my chapter on practical projects is this, what I call anatomy of a great first project. And these are kind of design principles for creating regenerative projects. And to a large extent, they're based on a project that we did in Sarasota with the Transition Sarasota group that I started back in 2010. Project that's still ongoing called the Suncoast Gleaning Project. And what we do is bring volunteers out to local farms where the farmer has some produce that they can't directly make use of. So they could, it's not going to last till market next week, or they're tilling under a field to replant it. And we can bring the volunteers out, we harvest it, and then that goes to our local food bank and the food insecure in our community. So drawing some lessons, and this has been pretty wildly successful. We've donated over 500,000 pounds of local, mostly organic produce up to this point. The project is still growing. It's been widely celebrated. What makes this project so effective? And there's 8 points here. One is that it addresses a real need, something that people see as a real need. It's not too abstract. People can really understand it. Even in a relatively wealthy county like Sarasota County, Florida, 25% of kids are considered food insecure. So people can see a real benefit in the here and now, as well as laying a foundation for a more regenerative community in the future, which we know that local agriculture is an important part of. It also harnesses existing energy. As we'll talk about later, it's not just food that we need to work on, not by a long shot. We really need to transform every aspect of our community. But back in 2010 in Sarasota, there was a lot of energy around local food systems. Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, just came out a few years before. There were a lot of big documentary films like Food Inc. About our agricultural systems in this country. And there was kind of a renaissance of local food and farming going on. So instead of swimming upstream to address some issue that the community wasn't really focused on at that time, we tapped into that and we said, how can we take this further? How can we really grow the local food movement and show people that real change is possible, bring back some real hope that ordinary people like you and me can make a difference. Another one is that it fits your group's capacity. So, that's going to be different from a local grassroots organization that's all volunteer, just starting up, and say, local government or county government. But it needs to fit your group's capacity so that you can do it and you can do it well. I think it's much better to do a few things really well with excellence than do a bunch of things half-assed. People don't tend to appreciate that. And we also don't want to pick a project that's so large that it eats up our entire capacity so that we can't possibly do anything else. We're just totally, exhausted by this one project. So in 2010, with Transition Sarasota, we had a very low capacity. But we already had a relationship with this one farm, Jessica's Organic Farm. I had worked there previously for 3 seasons. Had a really good relationship with the owner of Jessica's Organic Farm, knew all the people. We could come in there with 2 hours of harvesting a week, maybe 4 hours total, with me just sending out emails to a volunteer list to gather people up, and harvest 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of food. And people could really see the impact of that and feel like this was a good bang for their buck. They were able to make a significant amount of change with a pretty small investment. Gets as many people involved as possible. Sometimes this is actually looked at as something that's a liability, that we have to get a lot of people involved. Where are we going to find the people? But I think with something like this that gets a lot of people involved, they're not just standing on the sidelines cheering us on and saying what a great thing you're doing. They're saying what a great thing we are doing. And that's much more empowering. It gets people used to taking action and feeling their own power. And when people are out here, they're picking green beans in this picture. A lot of people had amazing discussions and made new friendships, forged connections that really, bonded them to each other and to Transition Sarasota, the Suncoast Cleaning Project, what we were doing. So they're more likely to be involved in the future. 5 is that it's a win for everyone. Oftentimes, there are situations where, it is a zero-sum game. Somebody's got to lose for somebody to win. But there are other projects, other situations that can be a win for everybody. In this case, this project was a win for those relying on emergency food assistance that couldn't get really healthy, nutritious food prior to that. In 2010, before we started this, if you wanted fruits and vegetables for your family, you'd probably get, at best, some juice boxes and a can of soggy green beans. So it was a win for them. It was a win for the food banks because they could provide this with no charge. We were doing all the work, and all they needed to do was come pick it up with their truck and distribute it out. It was a win for the farmer because, as we know, small farmers have a tough time of it in this economy. U.S. agricultural policy for many, many decades has been to make food as cheap as humanly possible, which has been mostly eliminating farm labor as much as possible and substituting fossil fuels for labor. And so it's very hard for small farmers to compete, but they got a tax deduction for the full value of the produce that they donated. And for volunteers, they got to take home a bag of produce for themselves. So it's a win, 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 and win for the organization because it was an effective project that we could then showcase. It also makes for a great story, you know, very photogenic, very beautiful, you know, biophilia. You know, this is something that we have as humans, a love for the natural world. You know, this green color really turns us on. It means safety, it means abundance in our evolutionary brain. It was also just very easy to explain. You know, some other projects, you know, that are more abstract, it's a little bit harder to explain, but a head of lettuce that's going to a hungry person, who can oppose that? And with all the bad news that's in our world today, media really picked up on this. There were probably, there were dozens of, you know, TV and radio interviews, magazine and print articles about the Suncoast Gleaning Project as a result. It can be scaled up and replicated. We started out with one farm. Then as we learned how to manage that and get the project working, we could interest other farms, and we have. We've also expanded into farmers market produce rescue, also into residential fruit tree gleaning. Lots of fruit trees in Florida, but also a lot of older people who are not able to maintain their fruit trees. So we can come in and harvest all of that. It doesn't just rot on the ground. So it could be scaled up, but it could also be replicated. We actually got contacted in 2014 by the Florida Department of Agriculture saying they wanted to set up pilot projects, gleaning projects all over the state, and they wanted to use ours as a model. And then finally, it stacks many functions. So this comes from permaculture design, the idea of one thing serving many different purposes. And because we ticked all these boxes, these are all functions, this was a very effective project. It had many different benefits that flowed from it. Good projects can be, maybe have some of these, but not others. But the best projects, I think, would have all. So it's called Anatomy of a Great First Project, but I think these are project design principles that really could be applied to the design of any project. Particularly early stage projects, because at that point you have to be more opportunistic, you have to be more careful. Later on, when you have more resources, more connections, real reputation and track record, lots of support, you can do bigger projects and think about what is going to make the most tangible impact, or what kind of infrastructure do we need to add now to make other things possible down the line. So those are other factors for larger projects. But I think all these still remain valid for any kind of practical project. But yeah, the Suncoast Gleaning Project is far from the only kind of regenerative project that ticks all those boxes. I'll share a number of other examples with you from the Transition Towns movement. So this is the Victory Garden Initiative in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which spun out kind of early on from the Transition Milwaukee Initiative. To date, they started out using this model called a permablitz, so it comes from this idea of permaculture. But how it works is typically somebody raises their hand and says, I'd like to rip out my lawn and plant an edible garden instead, because there's many, many benefits to that. And they invite a whole group of people to come to their house and help them do that in a day or a weekend. The owner would pay for all the supplies and maybe provide a lunch for the volunteers. And then the volunteers who come can earn credit to have the same thing happen at their house. Have a bunch of volunteers come there, rip out their lawn, plant an edible food garden, or maybe a native landscape. So they did that. They started out with a Memorial Day blitz, and they got a couple dozen of these gardens going, and it grew from there. And now, last I heard, they've planted over 6,000 edible gardens throughout the city of Milwaukee, which is just very impressive. Now they have their own farm as well. They work with hundreds of local school kids to teach them how to garden every year. Another great first project is a repair cafe or a fix-it clinic. Many of the different transition initiatives that I've visited on this tour have these repair cafes, fix-it clinics. The idea of a repair cafe began in Denmark, or maybe it was the Netherlands. I think it was the Netherlands. But it quickly spread. It's the idea that, we don't have shops around now to fix most of the things that we buy. Our society has been designed to be this consumer culture where we use things for a few years, they break, and then we just throw them away, and we get a new version of that thing. But lots of things can still be fixed. And so repair cafes bring together volunteer fixers, people with skills that still exist out there in the world, and calls in people who want their stuff fixed. And oftentimes they'll be asked to actually sit with the fixer and learn how to do it for themselves. As their item, whether that be a piece of clothing or some electronics, vacuum cleaner, some cookery, whatever, bicycles, so far and so forth get fixed. And this is the Transition Pasadena Repair Cafe. The guy in the middle is the founder of the Transition Towns Movement, Rob Hopkins, on his one and only tour to the US. Transition Pasadena got written up in the New York Times for this, and now there's hundreds of these repair cafes throughout the country. This is actually another picture from Transition Sarasota and a launch event for our local time bank. That was called the Commonwealth Time Bank. Many transition initiatives, many other groups have these time banks where the currency, instead of dollars, is time. And everybody's time is worth an hour. Same thing. Whether you're a brain surgeon or you're a babysitter. And lots of things get exchanged through these time banks, which are essentially like a Craigslist with different value system and this time currency. So you can post offers, you can post requests, things that you need. I need somebody to tutor my kid in Spanish. I need somebody who's willing to build a fence for me. And they come and do that, so they spend 3 hours building that fence. You use the online system, you type in the transaction, and it credits 3 time dollars to their account, 3 hours to their account, and then they can use that to spend on anything else that's on offer in the system. And it's not really meant to replace dollars, because you're not going to get your iPhone for time dollars. Verizon's not going to accept that, neither is Apple. But it does start to bring out some of the hidden talents and gifts that are undervalued in our community, and build a recognition that we are more than just our jobs, that we can do lots of things. And a lot of these time banks also often have projects that they're particularly focused on. So like the Dane County Time Bank in Wisconsin, which is one of the biggest in this country, has about 6,000 members, and one of their main projects is a youth court to keep teenagers out of the criminal justice system, and those who volunteer on the youth court get paid in time dollars that then they can use for other services. And a lot of other time banks are focused on child care, elder care, food growing, etc. Another great first project is Solarize Initiative. Some of you may be familiar with this. They're all over the country. But it's basically bringing together a group of people who are interested in purchasing solar energy, putting photovoltaic arrays on their rooftops, and negotiating bulk pricing with a solar installer. So it's a great opportunity to kind of rally people together who want solar and maybe get them off the fence, but also to reduce the price of that. And this is a photo from Transition Town Media in Pennsylvania that got about 50 homes in their first round of the Solarize Initiative to get solar on their rooftops, and inspired Solarize Philly and other Solarize initiatives in their area. And then the last example of a great first project that I have is Transition Streets, which was first developed in the UK by the transition movement, and the first official transition town initiative called Transition Town Totnes. And then a US version of this was developed. There's other similar programs like this, for example, Cool Blocks, if people are familiar with that. But it's basically a curriculum that is designed to have neighbors go through together, self-guided curriculum of looking at their food consumption, their energy consumption, their water consumption, their waste, transportation, and how can we reduce our environmental footprint in all these areas. And you could find this information online in various places, but the power of it really comes from groups of neighbors coming together to go through the curriculum together, because they can inspire each other, they can provide tips and advice to each other, they can help each other, they can keep each other honest, they can serve as accountability partners for each other, and in the process they build community. And a lot of Transition Streets groups have actually gone on to do more wider neighborhood scale projects after looking at their own homes and households. These are all pretty fairly lightweight projects that could be done by volunteer groups with very little special expertise, very little investment of capital, but can kind of get the ball rolling, right? showing that that group can make change and that can lead to bigger things. So that's great, but Repair Cafe is not going to profoundly change a community all by itself. Doing transition streets is not going to profoundly change a community all by itself. So how do we scale up, get to a level of scale that actually is kind of making a dent in the problems that a local community is facing? There's a number of ways. One way that we already talked about a little bit is teach others to replicate our success. If we can do one of these things and do it really well, we can teach others to do the same. It may not work in every situation, but in a lot of situations it will. We can also expand existing projects, like I talked about with the Suncoast Cleaning Project, that we started with one farm and we moved to many farms, and we incorporated other aspects of produce rescue. We can also catalyze working groups. So a single group only has so much capacity, but this is a strategy that transition town initiatives often use, is that they put out a call to the community to say, what are you interested in working on? And facilitate people gathering together around common interests. It could be food, it could be housing, it could be transportation, it could be education, it could be the arts, it could be lots of different things. And then forming a group around that topic that then is putting on their own events and creating their own projects. And the central group is actually just mainly serving to facilitate and to help those working groups do what they do. That's another strategy for scaling up. Also forming coalitions. There's probably many groups already in this community that are focused on energy. You have solar energy companies. You may have nonprofit organizations that are focused on energy. You have your city utility. And you can bring together all those different players in the energy system and say, let's work together. We could have more impact if we work together. And same thing could be done around pretty much any topic. You can find who are all the stakeholders, who are all the players in that area around housing, around food, and bring them together to scale up their efforts. You can also run thematic campaigns. So this is part of what we did in Sarasota. Was, we had the Suncoast Cleaning Project. There was a lot of success there. So subsequently, we started an annual Eat Local Week that brought together dozens of partners to put on dozens of events, grab some media attention, and showcase the best of local food and farming in Sarasota and Manatee counties. And we also created an Eat Local resource guide and directory that mapped out the whole local food system and made it easier for people looking for local produce to find it. And that benefited all of the different businesses. Eventually we had about 260 listings in our Eat Local guide. And this was all focused around a campaign to shift our local food economy 10% towards local food. We were currently at less than 1%, so this was a fairly ambitious task to grow the local food economy 10 times over. But it was also something that anyone could do. Go to the farmer's market once a week, get a CSA, grow a backyard vegetable garden. So there was a study done in 2005 that showed that would actually add $80 million a year to the Sarasota County economy if everybody in Sarasota County could do that, which vastly outstripped any of the other economic development proposals that were on the table at that time. We started getting some buy-in from our mayor, from county commissioners, from local foundations around that goal. That was around the time that I then left Transition Sarasota to go to work for Transition US. So yeah, that was kind of dropped subsequently to me leaving. But yeah, the thematic campaigns, 100% renewable energy by 2030. I've heard that you have that goal here. That's something that you could catalyze a lot of energy around. How do we meet this goal? There's going to be lots of different things that are needed. And then to implement more ambitious systems changing strategies. So that's what we're going to pivot to now. So what are kind of some of the things that might be considered a system changing strategy? One is rebuilding local and regional food distribution networks, right? So it takes a lot of energy for the farmer to hang out at the farmer's market all day waiting for customers. And it takes a lot of energy for individuals to all come to the farmer's market. But what if we could aggregate produce from all the local farms in the area and get that into the grocery stores and the restaurants, the places that people are already going? That can be a huge strategy. So in Liège in Belgium, the transition initiative there started a project called the Liège Food Belt. Big vision for revitalizing agriculture in that region. And they've since fostered the creation of about 14 different food cooperatives. So you have farms, you have markets, you have bicycle delivery service, you have granaries, wineries, breweries, an organization that helps to pair up people who want to grow food but don't have land, people with land who don't want to grow food. And this is something that has been really taken on board by the regional government there as one of their kind of key initiatives moving forward. A lot of transition initiatives from Fujino, Japan to London, England have created community-owned renewable energy companies. So I know you have a municipal utility here. That's great. A lot of places around the country, have monopolies of private utilities who may be not really serving the best interests of their local population. Just looking out for their own shareholder profits primarily. These community-owned renewable energy companies work by taking small investments, even a few $100s or a few $1,000s, and some of them have raised as much as 22 million pounds. Bath and West Community Energy in England. And has done 34 different solar projects. This is a picture of one in Brixton, England, that is raised money to put solar photovoltaics on public housing to reduce the energy bills of the community's most economically disadvantaged residents. But also when there is a surplus, when there are profits, these community-owned renewable energy companies direct that back to these small local investors, not distant shareholders. Another project in Brixton, but in many, many other places, local complementary currencies. So these, again, are not expected to replace national currencies, but because they can only be spent locally, Walmart and Target have no use for a Brixton pound, they continue to circulate locally. Building wealth instead of being siphoned off back to corporate headquarters, exacerbating wealth inequality. The biggest currency, local currency in the UK was the Bristol pound. There were 280 businesses locally that accepted it. There was almost £1 million in circulation. The mayor took his full salary in Bristol pounds. You could use them to ride the bus, pay your taxes, pay your energy bills. You could get it for ATMs or use a pays-by-text system. And they retired this, they retired the Bristol pound in 2021, but they're now working on the next iteration based on what they learned from that experiment. Besides just the economic value of local currencies, they can be strong symbols of community pride, like this here in Brixton, where they have their hometown hero David Bowie on this 10-pound note. I think way cooler than our drab olive bills with old white men that we don't really even know what they did anymore. Local investment, another key area, of the trillions of dollars that are invested in stock markets worldwide, not a single penny of that goes to locally owned independent businesses. It goes to fuel war, it goes to support new fossil fuel developments. And even if you're doing socially responsible investing, which is better, often you're still supporting the growth of things that maybe are in direct conflict with your values. So local investing is about investing in local businesses, local people that you know and trust and believe in. And this is a picture from a transition initiative in Port Townsend, Washington, called Local 2020. They started a project called the Local Investing Opportunities Network, or LION. And it has to date directed $11 million in investment in their little town. I think they only have like a couple thousand people in Port Townsend. But they've directed $11 million into dozens of local businesses, including this is a 21 and over movie house, independent movie house in their town, but supporting community bike shops and cideries and all sorts of great things that make their community a better place. Instead of just all the chain stores and strip malls that we see so many places in this country. Community land trusts, taking land out of the speculative market by placing it in a trust that is designed for a specific purpose. So some of these are agriculturally focused, some of them are more housing focused, but they're all basically run by a nonprofit board that is usually made up of people who are directly involved in the project, but also people who are part of the greater community that project is a part of, and need to be managed according to a set purpose in perpetuity, whether that be affordable housing or regenerative agriculture or something else. This is a picture of two of the founders of the Dishmagoo Community Land Trust in Humboldt County, California, which started as a partnership between the Wiyot tribe of Northern California. This is their head, Michelle Vassell, and a transition initiative called Cooperation Humboldt that was at the time run by a man named David Cobb, who was also a Green Party candidate for president in 2012. Very long shot. He also started the Move to Amend movement to end corporate personhood. And so David is an incredible organizer, really seeing the value of supporting the indigenous people in that community as great stewards of land over long periods of time. And they came together to form this community land trust. They have really big plans for it, creating eco-villages and youth employment. Their first project already received an $11 million grant from the state of California to create housing and wraparound services for homeless youth in that area. Some transition initiatives and other groups are also engaging in community-led redevelopment. So this is in Totnes, England, where the transition movement started. And they've been working on this project to redevelop this decrepit industrial site that's been sitting in the center of their town for decades, while private equity holding companies hold on to it for the value to continue to increase. And they said, we don't want them deciding what our future is. We want to decide that ourselves. So they formed the Totnes Community Development Society and started taking input from the community. They led something like 20 different input sessions with the community. I think 4,000 different pieces of input in a community of 7,000 people, and created a plan for affordable housing, for retirement homes, for a local foods cafe, an arts and culture venue, a health and wellness center, eco hotel, all powered by 100% renewable energy and owned by the community itself. Fortunately, they put this plan to a vote, and 86% of the local community voted for it. Unfortunately, right after that happened, they got all the money, they had all the support lined up, and one company sold it behind their back to another private equity company, and they're still, but they got that company's plan struck down by the voters, and they're still working on this. But I think they're going to win eventually. So many people are galvanized around this, and once that kind of community empowerment starts, it's really hard to stop it. They're not willing to give this up. And last example of these systems changing strategies is Ungersheim Village in transition. So they're, I think it was back in maybe 2011, their mayor watched a documentary about the transition towns movement called In Transition 1.0. There was also an In Transition 2.0, but he watched the first one, and he got so excited about this idea of being the world's first transition village that he rallied his entire government around this. They put together a 21-point plan for their community and just started putting it into place. And they basically fulfilled their whole plan at this point. It included becoming a fair trade town and completely banning pesticides and herbicides in their town. But two of the maybe most impactful parts of this plan, one was building out solar energy capacity, and currently they produce 5 times more energy from solar that are needed for this whole town, so they can export that energy. And using public lands for different regenerative projects. So they've used public lands for an eco-village, for regenerative farming, they've created 2 community kitchens using their local facilities, and they've transformed former mining sites into nature preserves. So this example, they also started using horses for transporting kids to and from school, a little horse bus. But yeah, it really shows what can happen when this kind of grassroots community action from the bottom up meets the top down kind of resources of local government. And you can see how all the different pieces can come together here. So last slide, many more potential projects than I've named here. But if we can put regeneration, this idea that goes beyond sustainability, it goes beyond, just doing enough, ideas like carbon neutral and so forth that are important, but there's already been a lot of damage that's been done. So repairing that, going beyond just doing less bad to believing in ourselves that we can do more good. And going beyond the idea of resilience as well, which is about how do we respond to shocks? How do we build the ability to bounce back quickly from the shocks that we know are coming? But actually really healing the land and bringing not only natural ecosystems, but also cultures and individuals back to life. If we can put that at the center of our community, it's going to change everything. The natural environment. How do we treat the natural environment? How can we regenerate degraded landscapes? How can we cultivate more biodiversity? How can we encourage more native plant use? The built environment, how can we reconfigure that to be regenerative or at the very least sustainable? Maybe more mixed use development, maybe building around different mixed use hubs that then enables public transportation, because of the density, enables more public transportation to happen, putting in more bicycle infrastructure, better bicycle infrastructure, making our communities more walkable. Building out renewable energy, but as many of us probably know, even more important is energy conservation and efficiency. How can we do that? How can we revitalize local food and farming, encourage ecological practices, shrink the distance from farm to plate? How do we support particularly young people who are wanting to go into farming to make it economical for them? There are huge subsidies for commodity farmers. How can we balance that out and make a more level playing field? Water, kind of depends whether your community has more water quality issues or water quantity issues. But like where I live in the arid Colorado area, rainwater catchment, reuse of gray water and black water. How do we clean up our water system while using less energy and replenishing our aquifers? How do we cut down our waste? How do we reduce consumption? How do we create zero waste communities? Curbside composting. So many things. Economic solutions, we've talked a lot about that. What can we do in the health, education, and culture sphere that will aid this regeneration? Maybe more practical skills training, maybe more preventative and alternative health, and governance. How do we change governance to be more participatory, more deeply democratic? How can we engage all of the different parts of our local and regional governments in moving towards this goal of regeneration? So there's so many different things that we can do. These are not impossible things to accomplish. And the more that we do them, the more it will be easier to do more. Both because we're creating systems that actually make it easier to do the right thing, and also because the community feels more empowered, more able to change the status quo, to experiment with different ways. And if we can link local communities that are doing this together all over this country and around the world, we can begin to change the conversation. We can show that there is a viable alternative to business as usual, which we don't see right now if we're watching the evening news or listening to national political debates. These things are not even on the table. They're not on the radar. But if more and more people can start doing this in more and more places, they will become visible. They will become they will get noticed, because in a world where so much is falling apart and breaking down, they're showing a new way forward, a way that could actually be a better way of living.